IVM.
Welcome to Think Fast, where if you don't know Natu, you're about to.
Oh my god.
But let's
Bro,
admit
at least give
it
me
was a
a
moment.
heads up.
It was
At
a
least
moment.
give me a heads up with your tippanis and with your intros. Because my reaction, if you hear all of our past episodes, my reactions to everything is oh my god. Or
Very
in like
good,
different
very good.
Yes.
But before we get into
congratulations.
RRR, I have to do full call out to Elephant Whisperers, right? Gunit Monga and Sheikha have always done like some fabulous pieces, and this is the first Indian production to win an Oscar. And as much as you might talk about RRR
Insane.
winning the thing, I think you got to talk about Elephant Whisperers and the fact that it won the award that it did. And
Yeah.
it's a moment. Yeah? And she spoke about two women who made this movie, and it's gone to the global stage and it's won an Oscar, and you got to kind of clap for that first.
Yup. Hundo.
And then you get to RRR, where like I actually thought the performance was awesome. What they did with the whole Broadway style RRR thing was actually very, very cool. No, do you see how they shoved Jimmy Kimmel off stage in his opening monologue?
That was hilarious. That was too good. No, but like I don't know about you. I mean, I'm sure you were, but I was like very like happily emotional. You know what I mean? Because you had Deepika Padukone making the announcement, and then you had, not like it was awesome that it wasn't your typical idea of a Bollywood movie, you know what I mean? Which was up on the stage. And as someone who was a late RRR convert, what I will 2000% give credit to, and not like my opinion matters because they just won an Oscar. But I love how anyone can watch the film. You know what I mean? Like, it's enjoyable whether you get the language, you don't get the language.
Yeah. I guess that's what's really worked. Right? And even if you like see any interviews, Rajamouli says this. He talks about the fact that he didn't expect this to be as big a deal in, let's say, Western markets, but in the US, people just went nuts about it. Like it is like because he's got a certain visual flair and over the topness, which I think just kind of came across a lot more than, interestingly, not Bahubali as much, because Bahubali was also him, but this, because it wasn't as much mythology and was a lot more real-esque, I think that really worked. But I think in general, the Oscars was a lot more entertaining this year. I think the last time, I mean, apart from
no one
got slapped. But just some of the I love the fact that I think all the main winners, the speeches were just so much fun to watch. I love the reference to moms. I love the reference to the fact that just there's hope and everything else. And so I think it's generally like good vibe Oscars this time. I'm also happy Top Gun Maverick won an Oscar. It had to win some Oscar. But Tom Cruise wasn't there.
But I hate saying this, but like Everything Everywhere All at Once was an interesting movie. If your genre is interesting. Oh, I just could not handle it. Like it was just way too much depth for me.
It's been on my to watch list for a while, but I haven't gotten down to it. But going on swiftly to Grammarly. Grammarly has announced a new writing assistant feature called Grammarly Go. Of course, AI sub mein dal do, isi mein dal do. Tomorrow my khakra wala will also add AI to decide how much farsan you want, which makes no sense, the sentence I just said. But it makes sense though for Grammarly to add AI because it largely does that anyway.
Correcto.
In other news, which is like, why are we not surprised? Meta mulls the Twitter competitor codename P92. That will be interoperable with Mastodon. Meta.
Yes.
First sort out the platforms you have. Please add more things.
To the fuckery. Yes.
Don't P9 on anything. Just make sure that you sort out what you already have. Are you P9 too?
Jesus, no, I am not. But I'm going to switch gears to another story, which is Apple is reorganizing the management of its international businesses to give more focus on India. Interesting. Which has become an important market for the company. This marks the first time that India will be its own sales region at Apple, highlighting the nation's growth significance. This story is actually super interesting. And I don't know if you saw, but I think Apple's had like some pretty kick-ass years, at least for the past 2-3 odd years in India, where the iPhone consumer base has grown, erupted, and prospered. What do you make of this, man? And do you think this ties back to them wanting to check out of China for a bit?
And it's also about the fact that Chinese companies aren't doing as well. If you look at like a few years ago, largely some of the biggest phone makers in the country and phone sellers were all like Chinese, Xiaomi and Vivo and Oppo and everybody else. You don't hear too much from those companies anymore. I guess that really helped. And also the manufacturing in India has really helped. I'm guessing their pricing and distributions kind of amped up. Because if you remember, 3-4 years ago, Apple had minuscule numbers in India, wasn't able to kind of scale up. But I guess
Correct.
2 and 2, kind of working with the government, figuring manufacture, and secondly, the whole China effect have both helped. By the way, one small side note, and we spoke about Meta's point earlier. Supposedly, the team wants to use data of all Instagram users regardless of their participation in the new platform.
What? In P92? For P92?
For P92.
But that's unsurprising.
It's very unsurprising,
like,
but...
They always do this shit, man. In between Facebook and Instagram, like, I feel like if you have a Facebook login, you're basically screwed. Like, wherever you go, you're being stalked, followed. And you know what I mean?
Yes.
Doused with ads by the lalji folks at Meta.
Yes, well, Meta does that and Apple reorganizes. What else is going on? For the first time in decades, people bought more.
Oh, this makes me so happy.
But I have a point here. People bought more vinyl than CDs. Who buys CDs anymore? Let's be honest. I think it's an unfair comparison.
I agree with that. But basically, looking at both of them as like, old school, analogish type, mediums, that one is surpassed the other is. But I feel like vinyls generally, remember when I called it vinyl? Vinyl has done a very good job of their rebranding.
Yeah.
Like
I miss audio cassettes,
almost
though.
Become like, you do?
I was an audio cassette. I was a mixtape audio cassette person. I was never a vinyl person. I'm not.
But there's nothing like sexy about a cassette. You know what I mean? Like with vinyls, it's like this whole experience. You take it out of the cover, you put it into the, gramophone. My brain is like clogged with
same thing happens. You take a tape, put in a tape recorder, and you hit that just see
but then that thing goes up, and then it comes on like the vinyl, and then like you know what I mean? It's like a whole situation.
So before this becomes a vinyl versus cassette conversation, we shall move on to the next point, which is professional messaging platform Slack to adopt ChatGPT app technology. Abbe yaar. Okay, everybody has ChatGPT. Sab use karenge. Ye abhi news mein dalna band karo. Everything is ChatGPT. We are all ChatGPTs. The French government said Monday that it will make a deal with major retailers to cap many food prices. Are you still laughing about ChatGPTs?
Oh my God. Varun is so exasperated. He's just like, baad mein jao.
But
don't show me one more headline.
It's like saying everything is built on the internet. Yes, we know. That's what we all operate on.
Yes, that's true. Give us more
I'm just generally saying that
it's become a feature.
It's become a feature. It's become something you add into the way every single technology is built. And at some point, while everyone's doing it, I don't think it's news anymore. It's just something that everyone has to do. The only worry is if everybody builds it onto this platform and it is AI and it's learning. We've all seen Terminator. Think about that.
Yeah, AI is dumb. But in any case, we can talk about that on another episode.
That's what happened on Judgment
the last
Day.
two.
The Ayurveda Co. raises USD 12.2 million in Series A round led by Sixth Sense Ventures.
This is pretty interesting, man. I think the Ayurveda Co. has really been like, at it, adding bricks and bricks, one step at a time. Actually, the thing that's interesting is that beauty is still relevant. I feel like a lot of other categories, whether you look at fashion or even FMCG products for that matter, outside of BPC as a category, everyone's kind of like come and gone. You know what I mean? Like everyone's like been like a flash in the pan and then magically disappeared. Beauty seems to be that one category that still has fairly decent sized businesses coming out of it, and it is not giving up. Like with fashion, like fashion had a moment when like Myntra was peaking, not that Myntra stopped peaking. And then, the general excitement and brouhaha around fashion cooled down. It doesn't seem to have happened in the case of beauty, man. I don't know what your take on this is.
I think in general, D2C and personal care, etc., I think this category will always continue to grow because it's still very under-indexed. There's still so much opportunity there. It's just that people have stopped calling themselves D2C only. They're saying that term has kind of gone away, which I think helps because you have to be across both shelves. And as long as you're kind of building it like a product business and not trying to use terms to kind of get funding in, I think you are raising. And I think that's what happened in this case. And I think it'll continue to happen. In most of these categories, we still have the opportunity to create so many more brands across sectors. And it also shows that people are getting funded, and also people at early seed stage and even like Series A are still being able to raise in the market. It's very openly, it's a fact that across the investor circles you see this. It's only people who are trying to get investments at growth stage, Series B onwards, who are kind of struggling to get the volumes which they might want. So whoever has cash reserves is sitting fine, but it's the others who kind of struggling a little bit. But
$12.2 million is a really large Series A. This is not like a normal size Series A.
It's not.
This is like this is like Series B for a lot of companies, man. But irrespective of what series it stacks in, I hear you, which is, easier to sort of raise around momentum than, if you're already clocking that 100 crore plus GMV benchmark, and then you're trying to figure out, where next you're supposed to scale to.
Yeah. And so before we go into our break, we will run through a quick set of what we're doing today. Today is a slightly different episode. We obviously, everybody's been talking about the Silicon Valley Bank and what's been happening there. And so we thought, since you and I are not banking experts, that you will bring in, what do you call, you're calling him a black swan expert? Is that what you're calling him?
A black swan corresponder, Mr. Vidur Singhal.
Yes, he's coming in to kind of give us some insights. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about is going to turn technical. So in case some of it feels too technically, you might want to kind of Google a few of those terms. We'll try to give you a broader landscape of things. So that's coming up later in the show. We're also talking about this interesting article in the Ken about Hotstar and Disney Plus, and why for Disney Plus to grow, Hotstar has to die, which is it's quite a hardcore term, but it's interesting when you actually look at the numbers deep down. And also talk about this very weird new version of Spotify that they're launching, which is like a TikTokification piece, and which looks getting major backlash from people before it even launches. And also a very weird stream on event. So you're going to get into that. But all of that after this break, while I still celebrate. RRR. Welcome back to Think Fast, where if you are asking the question, where do I watch Succession because HBO is going off Hotstar, that's how the Ken started an article about the whole Hotstar Disney Plus thing that's been going on. Just for context, they lost the digital rights to the IPL. So one big chunk of subscribers went away with that. Jio took them off the bundle. They lost a huge ton of subscribers there as well. Now, they've ended their deal with HBO, which they've had since, I think, 2015, where all HBO shows would be on Hotstar, and people are turning around saying, once again, what am I subscribing to Hotstar for? Right? And it seems to be a bizarre set of moves for them. And there's an interesting article by Praveen Gopalkrishnan on the Ken, and he says that actually these are all strategic moves because for Disney Plus to expand, the Hotstarness needs to kind of go away. And it's in a very interesting breakdown. We'll leave the thread in the show notes. But the larger context here is the fact that Hotstar, obviously, as they became part of the whole Disney Plus piece, had multiple parts, which were reasons that people subscribed. The bottom layer was people who were just coming in for, let's say, regional cinema, movies and TV shows, etc. The middle rung were people coming in for the IPL, and the premium rung were coming for HBO, etc. The interesting part is when you look at the actual numbers of Disney, guess the average revenue per subscriber that Hotstar makes. They make 74 cents per, and this includes ad revenue. So compare that to a Disney Plus, which is $5.7 without ad revenue. That's the difference. So you might have a massive number of people, but the amount of money you're making is so little that at some point the IPL piece wasn't making economic sense because you're just building to scale, but you're not making any money off this. And it also makes the IPL the center of Hotstar. In the same way, the HBO shows become the center of Hotstar. I think if you look at what Bob Iger's kind of said post coming on board, he wants to focus a lot more to go deeper into Disney Plus franchises, Disney Plus content. And if you see the app now, the Hotstar app has also kind of changed to look exactly like the Disney Plus app globally. It's no longer looking Hotstar like, it's looking exactly Disney Plus like. So this seems to be almost a move to say, one second, there's no point in having thousands and millions of subscribers if you aren't making that much money from them. You'd rather get a core set of people who will continue to subscribe and go deeper. And that seems to be the case. But it's interesting to understand that we've always talked subscribers for all these platforms, but we've never talked about revenue per subscriber, which is what the most interesting part of this whole article, which according to me was.
Yeah, I kind of want to know why the Unsef, who writes for the Morning Context, retweeted this saying there are takes and then there are jokes. So I think there's more that meets the eye there, or maybe it's just the Morning Context, the Ken ka, whatever, Saas Bahu fighting that they keep having. So just a couple of things, right? Without having read the article, so, pardon me there. But none of this is like revelatory. In India, the only businesses that have subscription subscription only has never been a model. If you look at even Netflix in India for that matter, everything is, and maybe not yet, but over a period of time, everything is becoming a sum of parts. And if you look at it like, there's one marketing book I genuinely really like. It's called How Brands Grow by Brian Sharp. He articulates this much better than I will, but every single company in the world has a very long, mid to long tail of consumers who are transient consumers of the platform. It's like the same example that we discussed when we were talking about the Bloom and like Sajid Pai's report, right? Where power users, your top 5% Zomato, orderers drive like close to whatever the number was, 50-60% of their overall, revenue. The point that I'm getting to over here is these power laws of, subscribers and actual contributing users versus, overall consumers and users has existed pretty much across any consumer tech platform. And Hotstar also, for that matter, had a pretty, I know obviously during IPL and all, things have gone to shit, but they had a very robust and a strong sales team. They used to do decent revenues, obviously maybe not enough to recoup the cost of, first off, like buying that content, then distributing, marketing that content, so on and so forth. But, they made like a non-trivial amount of money through their advertising base. So the point that I'm getting to is every business model is a sum of parts. I didn't quite understand what about this article in the Ken was, particularly revelatory compared to things that we already know. Do you know what I mean?
It's interesting because you always looked at the subscriber base as a bundle, right? You look at the fact that, okay, can a OTT platform survive with a specific kind of content? Like look at a Lionsgate play that kind of came in some time back. You have an HBO Max, which now says that they might launch their standalone app. And one of the points he makes, which I found very interesting, it's an interesting insight to kind of think about, which is the fact that people don't subscribe for one particular kind of content. They want a mix of things. And the assumption always was Hotstar amongst all platforms. Because when Netflix first came in, Hotstar had the best mix. They had the IPL, they had, international shows with HBO, etc. And they kind of had the regional stuff and Hindi cinema. Now, if you look at any other platform, Netflix took some time to get its mix right. They have been evolving in the right direction. Amazon Prime actually, interestingly, has always had their mix very spot on. They even got into sports recently. So they're very interesting to look at. Hotstar, on the other end, I feel this mix piece works till it's a certain scale. What you focus on, I feel, is important. And the more I dug into this, and I'm not going entirely by what he's saying, but I think some of these things are interesting to think about, is that as much as you believe a bundle works, you got to think of the mix of the bundle and what you're prioritizing for the long term. And I feel that's almost a learning here. When you look at the content piece, you're looking at, okay, what is the mix here? How are you making money? But also, like, what are the sum of your parts? And are you leveraging the thing that you own the most? Which is, I think, the Iger model is interesting because he's saying, let's leverage what we own entirely, which is all the Disney franchises, versus leveraging what we don't own, which is HBO or, the IPL. And I feel that makes it's more long term. Plus, it's also, let's be honest, it also makes sure that he can like tighten up costs a lot more and lean this operation out.
It's Netflix's model. It's literally Netflix's model, right? Like go all in on original, go all in on content that will have a longer shelf life, that can be built more cheaply, that's almost proprietary to your platform. But I feel like every company gets to hear at some point, you know what I mean? The natural trajectory of every, it's not like Netflix started with original programming, right? Netflix also started as an aggregator. And not to compare, but if you even look at, retailers for that matter, retailers always start as aggregators, but then over a period of time, everyone becomes a private label, peddler. Right? So, and you become a private label peddler because that's how you keep your gross margins afloat. So the strategy is totally sound. I don't know if this is something that Hotstar would have, Disney plus Hotstar would have, eventually got to themselves, you know what I mean? Over a period of time versus it kind of being yanked the way it is.
And I think what we should also look at is saying who's going to become the biggest player of them all, because Hotstar was far ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
Everybody else playing catch up.
Don't you remember? Last year, everyone was just like, oh my God, Netflix strategy sucks. Netflix has totally screwed up India. We guys also discussed it on Think Fast, like Chomo.
Yeah, and they seem to have gotten their act together, some of the shows they're doing, etc. But there's also the biggest player in the room kind of coming in, which is Jio coming in saying IPL is free for everyone to watch. And if I've read right, they've acquired so many movies that they're going to have more movies dropping every week than anybody else, and Indian movies dropping every week than anybody else.
Holy shit. Wow.
So it's going to be like crazy. So they're basically going to have the IPL for free and like a ton of movies kind of coming out because they've bought a ton of rights. So it's going to be interesting to see how the entire landscape is skewed, because No, just think about like 4-5 years ago, right? Netflix was obviously just a new entrant, so tinier player. Amazon Prime also was trying to figure out. I think first couple of shows had done well. You had names like Star and Z, etc. were really like up top. Everything's flipped around in a very interesting way. So I feel that's what's interesting. And I'm also looking at saying who can kind of look at their bundles differently, because we are technically back to television, because Lionsgate Play now shows up in your Apple subscription or as part of Amazon Prime. Everyone's bundling into each other. So you're technically just buying a bunch of channels which have a lot of shows, and you're back to television.
We're back to where we started.
Exactly. So that's the reason I want to discuss story, because I think the landscape kind of changes. And I thought some of the points you made were interesting to understand, just the fact that you might have something for everyone, but what you leverage to get that something for everyone might be something to look into. Was my broader insight on this one. We're going to talk about the TikTokification.
Oh my God. Did you watch this, by the way? I totally did not catch this.
I watched bits and pieces. I mean, basically, they put up bits and pieces on their Instagram. I also went on the Vergecast, which if anybody's interested in tech news, great podcast to listen to. And now also watch, because they start putting the episodes on YouTube. They were fully dissing on the design and what they plan to do, because I don't think it makes sense what they're trying to do. And it goes against the base tenet of what Spotify is, right? I mean, just for anybody who hasn't seen it, Spotify is going to change the app in a way that you have almost like a stream of content. You swipe from one to the other on the app. Whenever you have one podcast clip going into one more podcast clip, or like a song going into another song. But it's very visual. It's very like full screen in that sense of the word. Unlike right now, when you kind of go, you get an assortment of playlists, etc. there. And there's been a large amount of like people saying, what the fuck, right? But I feel what's interesting is why they seem to be doing it. And I feel that's the insight from the Vergecast that was there.
Gen Z.
Just like two things. Right? I think two factors are interesting for Spotify. One is Spotify is supposed to be the world's foremost music platform, but all the hits come off of TikTok. If today a music label wants their song to become a hit, that song has to do well on TikTok. It doesn't matter if it does that well on Spotify.
Yeah.
People go from here. Like TikTok has literally made people launch shorter songs so they can become one TikTok.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's one global trend. So suddenly TikTok's taken over that part of it. Secondly, a lot of the podcast bet hasn't really paid off the way they thought it would. And they need to focus on ad revenue and creators, etc. They use the word creator the most across this entire stream on. They kept saying creator. They literally got, I think the Jonas Brothers came in and introduced one of the creators just to kind of introduce, got them in to introduce the creator. But if you look at it on ads on Spotify, either you're listening to the ad, or largely one of the things they actually sell advertisers is visual ads. But when you're playing Spotify, your phone's in your pocket or it's lying on the table. So you're not necessarily looking at that ad. So what makes you look at your screen is that you have something happening on that screen, which is why I'm guessing they've gone in this direction. But it fundamentally changes how people listen to things. And I feel that's the part which I don't really get. I'm like, I understand the reason why they're doing it, but it fundamentally doesn't align with how anybody listens to content.
Interesting. On Spotify specific. But maybe there is some insight there, right? Like, I know that they've had a major thrust on videos within podcasts itself. And I'm not a Spotify user, as you already know. But for example, like, can you watch music videos on Spotify? This is going to sound like a really dumb question.
They do play certain parts of it on loop when the song is playing. That's anyway been showing for a while, where that kind of plays one small, it's almost like an extended GIF that plays. You don't have music videos. Apple Music actually has music videos as a separate section altogether. But Spotify hasn't had it.
But not Spotify.
But video podcasts are now on Spotify. They have been for a while.
So I assume maybe there's some like early data on, a customer who uses Spotify for video consumption ends up being a more retained consumer. I don't know what it is. Like, these companies are fairly robust when it comes to using data to make decisions. But I have two other comments over here. One is, what is the future of Spotify? Because they haven't been able to crack anything super, super well, right? And let's be honest, music is a low margin game.
Terrible business.
So music, obviously, there's no monetary, there is a viewership future there. There is no like monetary predictable future over there at all. Their other bet was podcasts. And again, within podcasts, they acquired a bunch of podcasting companies like Gimlet and all. But now they've totally pivoted out of that, which is cool. Every, big company goes through their own changes, and now they've gone into the platformy type approach. What do you think their monetization is going to be? And do you think this, obviously you mentioned one part of it could be ads, but how do you think this is going to contribute to their growth?
I feel that they'll become a more and more video going ahead. They will have an audio component for music and even podcasts, but I feel they'll become more and more video. They have to, because the only way they can build it off an advertising business is to have some form of visual pieces there. Because in audio, there's only so much you can do, right? You can just have ad inserts there, and because people aren't necessarily paying for those subscription bundles. And I mean, I see more subscription bundles for every podcast player show up on Apple Podcasts. But I haven't seen that on Spotify. There's a lot of those. Everybody has a bundle. I don't know how many people are paying for it, but everybody from Indian to international to international podcast companies all have a bundle you can pay for getting early episodes, for getting ad-free episodes, and even access to archives. And that's, I mean, I started to use Apple Podcasts a little bit more of late because some of the shows I listen to, the episodes don't drop till, like, say, a week or after they show up on Apple Podcasts. So I might as well just go to Apple and get the episode is what I was thinking of. So I feel they'll have to go visual. They'll have to figure a way to make more money off audio.
But don't you think TikTok is their killer then? Because that's literally what TikTok is. TikTok is a visual Spotify.
TikTok is a visual Spotify, so they'll have to become a weird mashup of TikTok and YouTube, which is a bad idea if you ask me. And they're kind of stuck in the middle of no man's land, right? In that sense, or no woman's land, whichever one you want to choose. But I just feel it's a tough spot because they are the place everyone goes to for music. That's where everybody gets their playlist from. How do you get more people to pay for a Spotify premium account? Could be one of the ways to do it. But I mean, they launched their AI again. One more. They launched their AI Smart Shuffle feature and a few other pieces, but they're in a tough spot. I don't know how you reinvent audio. I mean, if you look at Apple's on the smart thing by just Apple Music is what it is. They have the radio, they have songs.
Also, it's a feature, it's not a product.
Exactly.
Like, it's one ginormous part of the overall suite.
Exactly. Apple can afford to do that. Apple can afford to pay for the kind of talent they get on. They get a lot of the exclusives. They do all that stuff. Because for Apple, it's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
Does this mean Spotify gets acquired? Is my question.
Dude, I wonder what their moat is going to be, because unlike Netflix, which again one could argue is sort of stuck in the middle of nowhere.
Which is my question.
Yeah. No, but Netflix's moat is still... Netflix, Spotify ka Milan. I'm here for that. I am here for that. Both have great branding.
Yeah. Netflix, Spotify, gaming, music, movie, shows. I mean, there's something there. Or does just like Disney buy everything off? Never know.
Perhaps.
Disney,
never know.
Perhaps. You never know. But please, whatever you do, Spotify, do not stop promoting my podcast because you love me.
Oh my God. Nice plug-in. Saved your own ass, son.
Saved your own ass. But okay, now it's time to go on from this to going to deep finance banking stuff and tap into the SVB, the MVP on the SVB to the whatever that else thing is. But we should do that after this break.
SBF. FTX.
SBF. Yeah, everything. Sab bolo. RRR.
RRR. Oh,
right
shit.
after this break. Right after this break.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Think Fast, where because Suchita has no idea what SVB stands for, and neither do I just thought it's a new ice cream flavor. We have someone who actually knows a little bit more about what's happened with the Silicon Valley Bank. I know that, but you don't. Suchita, I'm talking to you.
Of course, I don't.
We've got a special guest in here who Suchita suckered in to say that come in, talk about this because you get nothing for coming on this show. And I get to meet him and be nice to him because I am the nice one on this show.
Of course. Take all the credit. Why don't you
introduce?
Ladies and gents, our guest speaker / co-host from our last episode, Mr. Vidur Singhal, is back.
What's up, guys?
Very single, just in case any of you are watching this on YouTube.
Yeah, what happened to your reach? Nothing came off it last time.
Vidur, maybe it's your face, and maybe it's like a few things that you said on the last episode. People are just like, iske paas bahut dimag hai. No, but guys, jokes aside, Vidur is my smartest friend, and that's going to be my introduction about him. He's like a banker, poker player, overall, little boy genius, chota bheem. He's not really chota, but yeah, you guys get the gist. And he's going to give us the TLDR on all things SVB and what perspired / went down over the weekend. So why don't we kick off with that, man, Vidur? For those of us who haven't been glued onto Twitter and been creating threads about 10 things you can learn from the SVB debacle. How would you summarize what transpired over the weekend?
Well, firstly, Such, I follow you on Twitter, and I saw that you dunked on someone who created the thread. So to the extent I thought about creating a thread, I completely stayed away from it. But let me just say, listen, like, what a weekend, right? Like, what a weekend, because, you know, that expression, like, sometimes nothing happens for decades, then decades happen in weeks. This was one of those weeks. And I think we've been having a lot of those weeks in this decade in particular. But to sum it all up, you know, when VCs talked about it, they called it an existential risk to the VC ecosystem because Silicon Valley Bank went under, and it was essentially the bank of Silicon Valley. That sounds like a very obvious thing, but it actually served 50% of all venture-backed startups. And let's talk about why that's extra important, because there's a lot of startups that traditional banks don't like to touch, you know, just the way like people don't like entrepreneurs in India. Over there, you know, you can't get a loan, you can't get a bank account sometimes, and enter SVB, right? Like when everybody else is asking for your Aadhaar card and your voter ID and this and that, these guys are like, okay, you have a business card, let's go, let's start banking. And as a result, they had just become crucial to the ecosystem. The timeline of events, I'm going to keep it very high level here, you know, very forest for the trees. It's more important to understand the broader context. And of course, we're right in the middle of it still. This is, of course, Monday that we're recording. Over the weekend was the crux of the crisis. And Sunday night, US time, the Fed announced that they're essentially rescuing it, which is something we'll get into as well. So very forest for the trees. What happened is around Thursday and Friday, the stock price of SVB went down to such an extent because of some activities on their balance sheet that VCs raised the alarm. They're like, hey, this bank that we love, we follow the stock price, it's down 40%, 50%, 60%. They start messaging their group chat saying, guys, this is maybe risky. Let's take our money out. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it becomes sort of a traditional bank run. We can get into what that means as well. Essentially, too many people try to take out their deposits. Banks are not built to be able to handle that. By Friday, the bank is shut. And the whole VC ecosystem of the United States and India, to some extent, which we'll talk about as well, is wondering what is going to happen to all the funds they had in there, to the tune of $150 billion. It was the 15th largest bank in the United States, even before the withdrawals happened.
Holy shit. But major narrative violation literally this morning, right? I mean, everyone thought sab mar gaye, lut gaye, but, you know, Miss Yellen.
The narrative tends to be sensationalism and catastrophe. So in that sense, a narrative violation. I think what you're referring to is the fact that, of course, the Fed rescued the bank. A lot of people are calling it a bailout. We can get into why that might not be the right term. It might be colloquially correct to say that the Fed, which is the central bank, bailed them out. But bailout has a negative connotation, you know, because in 2008, with the global financial crisis, a lot of banks were bailed out, seemingly at the cost of the taxpayers. As it happens, by the way, over the course of 10 years, the taxpayers ended up making money on those bailouts, which is another narrative that gets brought up. But anyway, the Fed essentially didn't bail them out because the holders of the equity of SVB, it was a public company, almost $15 billion plus, down to zero, bankrupt, right? And the holders of the bonds, which is even worse, you know, if you're a bankrupt company, down to zero. But what the Fed has done, which was very, very crucial, is that they have promised that the depositors will be made whole. You know, and this is a very important thing to get into. Forget the bailout, forget the politics of it. These depositors were not just VCs and Silicon Valley startups. I mean, a lot of them were. There were a lot of business accounts. The bank was very unique. We can get into why this happened in a moment. But these were real people, like real money. And to give a context of the scale and the size, this is 10 FTXs put together of not crypto gamble funds. This is real businesses, real money. In the US, by the way, payroll happens on the 15th. So they had a couple of days to make payroll and they were looking at empty bank accounts. So if the Fed hadn't stepped in and said, all your deposits will be accessible, as opposed to the 250,000 that is guaranteed by the FDIC, which is sort of an insurance scheme. We have this in India as well, by the way, up to 5 lakhs. 250,000 is not too much for a business, as both of you know, right? Yeah. What would have happened on Monday? Every business looking at what happened to SVB across the United States would have called their banker and said, bro, $249,999 balance hona chahiye. Everything else should be in government bonds. And that's it. I don't want to deal with this like counterparty risk with my bank. So the Fed had to come in and inject a lot of confidence in the system. And I have to say, like, this is a weird thing for like Bitcoin and crypto people to wrestle with, because actually it just shows how faith-based our money system is. It's just the nature of it. Fractional reserve banking is what we use, where banks don't need to have one-to-one deposits. They take your deposits, they give most of it as loans, they keep about 10%. If more than 10 or 20% of people come and demand their deposits back, you're going to have a run on the bank. And on Thursday, $42 billion was asked for withdrawals out of SVB, their total being $180 billion. No bank could have taken it. So anyway, the Fed came in and sort of saved the narrative, as you said. But the question is this enough? Just to add some historical context, and do stop me if I'm ranting a bit, but in 2008, everybody remembers the Lehman moment, but people forget the Bear Stearns moment, which was March of 2008. Lehman was September of 2008. Bear Stearns went under. The Fed forced JP Morgan to buy it at a very low price. It's not exactly a bailout, but something similar. And then everybody was like, oh, I guess we're saved. I guess we avoided disaster. 6 months later, the global financial crisis happened. So we got to be cautious. We got to really think about the root cause here, and then really think about the second order impacts as well.
I just want to pick up one thing. Like I was looking at the balance sheet of the bank and just to understand where this kind of happened. And the whole point is that they went too heavy on bonds is what I got from it. It's like they went too heavy on bonds. And then when there was, I think the interest rates were hiked, and that's what led to them coming to this point.
Yeah, it's a very actually good basic summary of what happened. Now, I have to say that is the role of a bank. As I just said, they take deposits. So that's the liability side of the balance sheet. And they go invest them in assets and they make money on the spread, what they call the net interest margin. Now, SVB was unique because they had such a high exposure to startups that they were double dipping on the zero interest rate environment. You know what I mean? During zero interest environment, startup funding went through the roof. Right? Obviously, there was crazy money everywhere. So the deposits went up about 4x over the course of 2 to 3 years. No bank can handle that growth. Now, they have to do something with this money, right? How else will they make a margin? So they went and put a lot of it into, most banks will give out a lot of loans. Let's say 50% of their asset size will be loans. These guys were a little light on the loans because they grew so fast. They invested a lot of it in securities. Now, these are safe securities, but at the low interest rate environment, they were yielding, give or take, 1.5%. 2 years later, the Fed, which has, by the way, essentially had 2 extreme cycles within 2 years. Usually, each cycle should be 4-5 years. Rates go up, rates go down. Because of COVID and the shock to the system, the cycle has been so extreme. Rates went up to 5% instead of the expected 1.5%. So those bonds that you're holding that are paying 1.5%, just by doing bond math, when the rates go up, they're worth 20% less. So these guys were sitting on essentially a 20% unrealized gain on their books, unrealized loss, excuse me. And the way bank accounting works, I used to cover banks as an investor. It's very funky. It's like the whole system has just been engineered to make it work. And so you get to decide when you take a loss. You get to decide when you mark to market. There's a lot of regulation that keeps everything at bay. So essentially these assets that were not worth as much as they were in the past had not been marked to what their current value was. So the timeline actually was that when they started facing withdrawals, they had to sell some of these. They had to absorb the loss. Those unrealized losses became realized. And then they went to the market and said, hey guys, we've actually lost 2 billion because of these losses that we had to realize. So we want to raise more capital. We want to raise 2 billion. And then finally they shone the light of themselves where people were like, okay, let's look at these books, why they're raising 2 billion. And they realized these guys were sitting on a whole bunch of assets that weren't worth as much as they were on the actual books. So now to the broader point, the Fed has done this and every bank holds these securities. Right? These guys had about $20 billion in unrealized losses, which was more than the book value, the equity value. Hence, they went under, right? You're bankrupt. You have liabilities more than your assets. You're bankrupt. Wall Street Journal did a quick calculation of unrealized losses amongst all the banking system, 680 billion, give or take. Now, how do you manage that? That's what the Fed is trying to do. And we can get into how the Fed is doing it in a moment. It's a little bit granular, but this is an existential risk sitting there. It's just that most big banks are not as exposed to these securities as SVB were and are better risk managers. Let's not take away the blame from SVB. Of course, your job as a bank is to manage your risk, which they didn't.
Yeah.
If you go broader on this, right, there's the technicality of it that you've spoken about. How does this affect, let's say, how VCs function going ahead? And more importantly, how does this affect, let's say, global startup ecosystems, let's say India, other markets as well? Does this spread that far, apart from maybe a Y Combinator, which I know has some legs which have come this far, but does it really affect the other markets as much?
It's interesting. Can we talk about the Y Combinator thing for a moment, just to contextualize how real the situation was in India? Because listen, you and I and the three of us, as in, were not affected, right? We were impartial observers. But, they made it a lot easier, essentially, to follow the news and be unbiased. But most Y Combinator companies that come from India are essentially given this one option of opening an account with SVB for the reasons that I highlighted earlier. So we had between 60 to 100 Indian companies who had immediately lost access to their funds because they only repatriate into India ever so often. Now, also what SVB does is they create this relationship with you as a founder. What is their goal? Their goal is to go with you till IPO, right? Or like till you're huge, like a Razorpay or something. Then they also ask you to bank with them as a founder. You have a big windfall, you have a big sale, you put your personal money in there as well. So a lot of Indians were suffering. It's sort of emblematic of startup globalization today, mostly driven by Y Combinator, where, a bank fails in California and employees aren't getting their payroll in India, So there was a very real impact. There was a risk to the Indian startup ecosystem, at least over the weekend. Now, most of these guys have their money back. In terms of VCs, also very interesting because there's a little bit of mechanical thing to understand, like how do VCs actually fund their investments? There's GPs, there are LPs, you have to get money from LPs. Even if you don't want to get into all of that, essentially all these VCs have lines of credit with a bank. When they need money, they have to do a capital call with the bank. So VCs couldn't do that. Not to mention they put all their investment gains into the bank, etc. So the whole VC ecosystem was extremely at risk. And by the way, funding's not that hard to get right now, not that easy, to get right now anyway. So actually, a lot of people are worried about the ecosystem. And maybe, Suchita, you can comment on this. Like, if you have a systemic shock to like maybe, let's say, 20% of the VCs, what does it do to the remaining 80%? Like, are they pouncing and being predatory and trying to say, okay, let me get a deal the other guys couldn't get? Or does everybody become more cautious? I wasn't sure which way it would go, and I'm still not sure.
I think it'll always be a combination of the two, right? Like you'll always have, the little shark sort of circling companies or whatever else you could get at a cheaper rate. If you look at any of these things, whether it's the lockdown or, COVID or any black swan-y type events that have happened, irrespective of the scale, generally everyone sort of steers in the direction of caution. And I think right now, in any case, things are highly exacerbated because everyone is already so cautious. We haven't seen this kind of lull in startup activity in I don't even know how long. Like, Varun, if you remember all of our episodes last to last year in October, November, December, and even maybe Jan. Funding unicorn.
Decacorn, now, some meta con, some other cons were coming up.
Yeah. And basically, I think right now, because the environment generally is fairly tepid, this definitely didn't add to the mix. So, Varun, I want to get your perspective on this. And maybe I'm asking this because, this is the first time I've seen it run on a bank. I haven't seen it before, and not even at this much proximity. Like, Vidur, I'm sure you obviously, saw it up and close during the Lehman Brothers crash and this, that, and the other. But Varun, you are a seasoned old man.
When the last thing happened, I had not quit my job and not even started my first startup. I started my first startup after the Lehman Brothers crash, a year after.
Oh, shit. But what do you make of this? Because I was listening to a couple of podcasts and I think the general consensus from everyone is, this too shall pass, right? Like, all these systems are robust.
I think everybody has to look at it that way because there's this whole point of too big to fail that always comes up. That's what everyone kept saying when Lehman Brothers happened. But I feel in this case, I think everyone's waiting to see what the Fed does because that ripple effect goes everywhere. But I think very quickly also saw the fact that I think the UK counterpart was getting bought. I think SoftBank was trying to buy off the UK counterpart.
I believe HSBC bought it for $1, which is the usual rate when you buy things that are bankrupt because you take on their liabilities.
So all
the US
regions
one
getting
is still
bought
up
up
for sale.
Yeah, so I think that the regions getting bought up was an interesting thing to see. And I feel people have kind of learned from, I'm not saying learned in terms of they will not do stupid things like what this was, but I feel there's been enough work spent saying how do you manage things when stuff like this happens?
Firstly, not enough people are commending the Fed, okay? Because this thing went down on Friday and by Sunday, listen, it's their job. They have to do it. But the fact that it's a weekend doesn't help, right? And they essentially rescued the system because I'm telling you on Monday, you would have seen bank runs at a lot of banks, a lot of small banks, they call regional banks or community banks. Why would anyone keep above $250,000? Okay. So the first thing they did is they stopped that. But it's kind of like saying the Fed rescued COVID by printing money. Everything has a cost. So just to get into the very basic mechanics of what they're saying, how they'll rescue it is they're saying, hey, you have these assets sitting there that are worth 80 or cents on the dollar, right? Instead of being worth 100, which they were when you bought them. You come to us, you give them to us as collateral, we'll give you loan against them as though they're worth 100. Now that's ridiculous. You're giving a loan to value that's more than like what the thing is worth. But I mean, it's the Fed and it's the US. You can print money and nothing happens, right? Like it's the modern economic system that we live in. So the Fed is doing something that will have a cost. And this too is fine. This too shall pass, such, which is what you said. It does remind me of that meme with the dog sitting there in the fire and saying like, this is fine. Because like I said, like there's all these unrealized losses. Right. Every other bank has this as well. And I have to say, this was a very small mistake on the part of SVB. This is not like Lehman, where you had toxic assets. This is not like FTX, which was fraud. And this is not like many other situations that are like extremely bad risk management or like greed even. They bought government bonds paying 1.5%. It wasn't greed. It was growing too fast and not being able to handle it. Now with banking is a game of regulation. Okay, like even SVB kept their assets below 250 billion so that they wouldn't be regulated like a bank that is worth more than 250 billion. There's all these games you play. There is a little bit of greed, but they didn't do something too egregious, is my point, right? And now I do want to talk about the two other banks that also failed, which already points to a red flag of this being slightly systemic, right? Again, this is fine, right? The dog meme. So one is Silvergate, which happened earlier in the week. Much smaller bank, still $5 billion in market cap or so. And they were more famous for serving crypto. Okay, and we'll talk about crypto in a moment. So with crypto being as down as it is, right, it's like a high beta version of startups being down. Like obviously it's just like dead, right? Crypto winter. So they completely could not handle it. Makes sense that they went down, but very similar situation, right? Deposits have gone down, but the assets are like worth less than they were on the books. Okay, so first Silvergate goes down, then SVB goes down. Then even someone like me who's glued to Twitter, but too busy with the startup world. I have friends in YC, I'm talking to them. Completely didn't realize that this other bank called Signature Bank, $90 billion in assets, went down over the weekend as well. And the Fed announced it when they said, by the way, we're rescuing SVB. And by the way, also we're rescuing Signature. So like the bank cascade had already started. Signature had the same problems as well. A $90 billion bank, something around the 35th or 50th largest bank in the US. It's not a joke. Like these bank runs hadn't happened for 5 years or so. Not a single one. And this scale hadn't happened since 2008. So there is this, there should be a question, we should be thinking about it. As I mentioned with the Bear Stearns example, I did my first internship on Wall Street in 2008, okay, at Goldman for the first time. The CEO of Goldman got $70 million in bonus, in 2008. And Lehman went down 2 months afterwards. So there can be that much of a discrepancy between where like even the experts think that we are at and where we are actually at.
So I have a question. Do you feel this also has happened, like you mentioned, because of the rate hikes happening the way they did? Because you said, right, within like what a 1-2 year period, they've gone from like literally like no interest rates to like going the way they did, which generally is slightly more cyclical. You have at least like a longer period doing that. So is the Fed really kind of sorting out the problem they only created?
Very interesting. They're not, because technically it's on the bank to manage it, right? But nobody was used to managing these kind of moves, right? But it is still on the bank. And there are many, many investment banking solutions that exist, interest rate swaps and interest rate hedges to hedge this risk. But like banks are run by humans, like if you do a good job, you do a good job. And if you don't, you don't. And the regulators that are supposed to oversee it may or may not catch it. What is the Fed doing going forward? This is a big macro thing, and it does have a huge impact on the global economy. They had actually said they're going to increase the rate 50 basis points more still remaining. And there's a lot of chatter that after this has happened, you surely can't be thinking about that, right? It would only increase the losses on these like banks' books and create a lot of risk in the system. So that actually might impact US monetary policy, which for all intents and purposes is global monetary policy. So another second order effect that is very, very big here.
So I want to come in with a quick question, and not to, sound all like Enid Blyton about it, but what do you take away from this? Because it's kind of wild that, SBF and obviously FTX in a larger context, SVB and, anything that's happened in the past, all of them have kind of been put into the same bucket. But, like you said earlier, the degree of manipulation in each of these cases is like, what I mean? Like, it's incomparable. Like what happened at SVB, one could argue was overconfidence ki theek hai boss, 2-3 saal mein theek hi ho jayega, versus, for example, FTX, which was straight up fraud. I'd love your thoughts on what do you do in scenarios like this where, all of these generally catastrophic events are thrown into the same bucket, assuming that, it was the same sequence of events that led to these outcomes, though actually in each of these cases, what led to, catastrophic outcomes, obviously we didn't see all the way to unfold in the case of SVB, is dramatically different. You know what I mean? Like what do you learn from this? Because so much of it is like, is I don't want to say luck, but you know what I mean? Like so
Put
much
your
of
money
it is
in
like,
gold. I'm joking. I'm not saying.
Yeah, well, I mean,
gold.
I'm sure there's a
Great
lot of gold
financial
hawkers.
advice.
No, there's a lot of people who are using this as an example to do this. And coming back to crypto, a lot of them are saying put your money in crypto, because what did happen, this is not financial advice either, but what this does show is...
of all people, put
Yeah,
your
I know,
money
exactly.
in crypto. That was fucking
He was literally
wild,
saying
man.
that treasurers of companies should consider putting money in Bitcoin and Ethereum. But his point was that, listen, like this just showcases, this was what the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper was about. Banks are centralized. They're actually run by the Fed. We can't trust them. And also they run on a fractional reserve system. They don't have all your money when you want it, right? As opposed to, say, Bitcoin. So, that's something people can probably like look forward to over the course of the next 2-3 months, where the crypto case will be made. And there is merit to that. This is why Bitcoin was created in 2008. As for you saying all these incidents are correlated, it's what we just discussed. It's the rate shock. And the way they say rising tides lift all boats. What happens when the tide goes down, which is in the case like rates go up? It exposes the ugly underbelly of all the boats that were swimming quite high, right? And I think that's what's happening. Now, is the underbelly fraud? Is the underbelly bad risk management? Or is the underbelly something else? I think these incidents are not correlated in that sense, right? I do want to talk about one of the narratives that came about, maybe because of the fact that's happened FTX, is a lot of anti-tech or like tech envy, anti-startup, and this part I understand a little bit more, anti-VC sentiment on Twitter. Don't rescue them. Screw them.
Let them die.
Let them die, right? And now my question is, like I said, these are real people, real employees, real startups, the innovation engine of, again, the biggest economy in the world, right?
Yeah.
If this was called the Farmer Bank of Kansas, which was an example floating around on Twitter, would people have the same let them die attitude? My guess is not. So there's also this messaging problem that I think tech people have also realized. They're very disillusioned, like, oh my God, this is what people think of us. I thought I was like changing the world, right? So like, what do you think? Like, and does that exist in India, you guys think?
I think the tech bro energy has generally been something which I think has divided, although has divided Twitter, but Twitter is a tiny fraction of the overall piece. But I feel generally governments are looking at startups very differently now. I think in India, I don't think it's as much, because over here there's a lot more control in terms of how they function. I feel as a system we function very differently. In the US, Silicon Valley operates like its own country, right? I think this is almost like a call out to that, is that Silicon Valley seems to be operating on a different planet and a different country, and the rest of America seems to be in a separate part of it. And there's always been that differentiator there, but I don't think that exists as much in India.
Fox News already said they went bankrupt because they went woke. So like,
of course they did.
Gotta love Fox News. Gotta love Fox News.
Just one last thing, at the risk of extending it just very slightly. We talked about Indian startup ecosystem being affected. We only spoke about the YC element of it, but I do want to throw this to you to just ponder, and your viewers and listeners as well. Like I said in the beginning, SVB was very, very heavily used because they were the most friendly to Indian startups. There is no alternative, by the way. Right? You have one bank that was basically
willing
to...
What are you saying, bro? HDFC, G's best, most efficient, easiest.
No,
best
but like,
but
how do you get in? I understand your sarcasm, but like name one American bank that even like as a joke would take you, right? And just to give you a sense of what the weekend was like for these guys, they're saying, okay, on Thursday, let's say you figure out your VC tells you get your money out, okay? What do you send the wire to? Who do you send the wire to? You don't have an account anywhere, right? Yeah. These people are opening an account without you having social security numbers because you're registered in the US. And by the way, at the risk of speaking out of line here, like the Indian government might not be kosher with all the banking activity that's going on, in the US with Silicon Valley Bank. They might look and be like, why is $2 billion that technically should be in India is lying there? So there is going to be a meaningful impact. This is far from over for startup guys, something to like actually for investors to help sort out as well. And we'll be seeing what happens.
I think the past 3 years weren't bad enough.
I think this also kind of is a signal, right? You're seeing a lot of startups, especially the tech side, looking at other options apart from the US. In general, it takes far longer to get some of this stuff done. And if you look at the Middle East and how they're literally like welcoming everybody, come to Abu Dhabi, come to Dubai. Singapore's kind of also kind of figured it's seen out. I think we're at an interesting time when startups will take points like these and say, okay, one second, we can't put all our eggs in the American basket. And I think that might be an interesting turn of events from this.
Atmanirbhar all the way.
Yes. Yeah. HDFC Bank.
Yes. And with that, thank you so much, Vidzi. Appreciate you popping in times of crisis. As always, first it was FTX and now it's SVB. Let's just hope
appreciate
there are no more
the black
crises.
swan.
But they will always be
the black
RRR.
Yes, go RRR, Varun. I know you're a man of culture, unlike our friend over here.
Oh my god, sure, of course. So much culture. Can't wait.
But anyway, thanks for having me on, guys. It was super fun. And I just think this Black Swan correspondent is a title I can live with. Like, I like this.
Yes. Yeah.
Love
Thanks
it.
so much for coming on, man.
Thanks, guys.
See you,
Have a good
bro.
episode.
Welcome back to Think Fast, where it's time for recommendations. It's a slightly longer episode today, but I think we've tapped into a lot of things, especially on the banking side. See, we both also know these terms. Okay, क्या सोचा था? नहीं जानते हम लोग जानते सब कुछ.
Of course.
Yes.
Just like
What's your
the
recommendation?
lyrics of Natu Natu.
What is your
What is my
recommendation?
recommendation? So guys, by the time this episode airs, I would have officially turned 33 because my birthday is on the 15th of March. Listeners, you guys are obviously recording 2 days before. I obviously took a short break and I've been taking breaks just to really reflect on like life and shit. And I have written this lovely post also on my Medium, which is suchitasalvan.medium.com, called Bloom Where You Are Planted and 33 More Things I've Learned at 33. So if you guys are in the mood for like a little chicken soup for the 33-year-old soul, please jaake padho and share the things that you know you've learned as you've aged. Not you, Varun, because you're too old.
I'm too old. But pre-birthday wishes to you. I shall send you a lovely box of my recommendations. Not something I normally recommend. I bought. Have you ever tried these Pebble Building Blocks? They're building blocks for adults. You can basically make those Pebble balancing pieces. It's so therapeutic. I just sit the entire day in any meeting and I have those building blocks in front of me and just building shit out with it. It's like you have to balance these small stones on it. It's amazing. Just look it up, guys. Pebble Building Blocks.
Like Maram Pitti.
Yes,
No,
so
like what
basically,
is that Pittu?
They're like, yeah, exactly. So Pebbles
What
is
is
a
that
building
thing
blocks.
called?
I don't know what it's called. But it's much
Abhi,
fun.
what was that game called that we played when you were small? Yeah, Pittu.
I have no idea.
Where
what
you
it's
have to
called.
like build the.
I don't know what
Okay,
they call it
never
in the Delhi, okay?
mind. Okay. Down south we call it Natu Natu.
Natu. Everything is Natu. But by the way, you know what Natu means?
No.
Natu means like you know, full like chapri, local, that kind. Like that's what it means. It's like Natu dance means like, you know, chapri dance. That's the literal meaning of what it is.
Suits you, Varun. Suits you.
Yes,
That's why
exactly.
it's your favorite song.
It's my vibe. It's my vibe. But that's it for this episode. By the time we come back for the next one, I will be in my hometown next week.
Oh my god.
And you shall be older.
Shit. A year older and wiser and richer.
Yes.
Let's keep that going.
Everything. Sab hoga. Kiravani will send me some of that Oscar gold. But that's it for this episode,
Can't
guys.
wait. Lovely.
Nothing from SVB is coming to you, but
Thank God. Please, अपने पास ही रखो SVB.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye guys. Bye.